Part 1. Liverpool. Night 1. The storm rolled in from the Irish Sea long before sundown, sweeping across the Liverpool docks with a ferocity that rattled every wooden beam of the lodging house where the migrants slept. Later generations would hear the tale again and again. How the night before the crossing seemed to test the resolve of every soul who dared to leave the old world behind. The lodging house was a narrow, sagging building wedged between a fish warehouse and an alehouse. It smelled of damp wool, sea brine, coal smoke, and too many crowded dreams. Wind forced its way through the thin walls, making the candles flicker violently whenever the front door opened. It was on such a night that 3 Nordic families, who had traveled far from their homelands, found themselves sharing the same space for the first time. It was not yet destiny, merely coincidence perhaps. But the historian in me knows that this was the moment when their stories first brushed against one another. Leif Vasterlunds sat closest to the wall, hands wrapped around the tin cup of weak broth. His fingers trembled slightly, though not from cold. He had been writing again, always writing, and the pages tucked into his coat were damp with the condensation of the sea air. Ingrid sat beside him, her posture straight despite exhaustion, while young Otto paced near the window like a restless animal. Across the room, the Finnish siblings, Sigrid and Vaara, tended to their cousin, Aino, who lay wrapped in blankets, her cheeks pale from seasickness that still clung to her after days of travel. The Norwegian family had claimed a corner near the hearth, Erik Bjørnsson with his daughter Runa asleep in his lap, Anders crouched beside him oiling a small pocket knife, and Liv, the grandmother, watching the storm through half-lidded eyes as if reading a language only she understood. No one spoke at first. The storm outside howled too loudly, and the weight of their journeys pressed too heavily on their shoulders. But storms have a way of breaking silence. A sudden gust slammed the window shutters open, sending a spray of cold rain into the room. Otto cursed under his breath and rushed to close them. The commotion startled Runa awake, and she whimpered softly. Ingrid rose without hesitation and crossed to Erik and child. "She's frightened," Ingrid said softly. "May I help?" Erik hesitated, then nodded, shifting Runa toward her. Ingrid knelt beside them, murmuring in Swedish, her tone gentle. Though Runa did not understand the words, children recognized sympathy, and she slowly quieted. This, too, is how bonds begin. Not with grand gestures, but with small mercies in dark rooms. Leif noticed the exchange and felt something warm in his chest. Ingrid always found her place in rooms like this, tending, soothing, creating steady ground where there was none. Otto, meanwhile, had already resumed pacing, occasionally peeking out the window as if hoping the storm itself might challenge him. Vaara nodded respectfully toward the Vasterlunds. "Storm won't let up soon," he said in accented Swedish, though loud enough that the Norwegians could also understand. "Could be days before we sail." Leif responded with a tired smile. "Then we wait. We've waited for many things." Liv Bjørnsson gave a low hum from her corner. "Storms test people. They show who is meant to cross and who is not." Her words sank deeply into the room. A shiver that had nothing to do with cold passed through several of them. A moment of quiet stretched. The wind roared. Then, unexpectedly, it was the young Finnish girl, Aino, who broke the silence. "Everyone here came from somewhere far," she said softly, her voice barely rising above the storm. Maybe we share the waiting by telling where we came from." Her cheeks flushed after she spoke, surprised at her own bravery. But Sigurd placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Leif looked around the room. The other families exchanged glances, some weary, some curious. It was Ingrid who spoke next. "We have time," she said, voice calm. "And storms pass easier when stories fill the air." Eric nodded slowly. Anders leaned forward. Even Liv's eyes opened more fully, watching. Leif felt Ingrid's hand touch his shoulder. "Brother," she whispered, "you begin." And so he did. He took a deep breath. The kind a man takes before opening a long locked door inside himself, and lifted his gaze to the gathered strangers who would one day become so much more. Outside, thunder rolled like distant mountains splitting apart. Inside, Leif began to speak. And as he did, the historian in me knows he never imagined that his quiet, snow-covered tale would echo across generations. Long after the storm, long after Liverpool, long after the northern crossing carried them all into the heart of a new destiny. Leif's voice was quiet at first, soft, as if the memories he evoked were fragile things that might crumble if handled too roughly. The storm continued outside, rattling the shutters with impatient fingers, but inside the lodging house all eyes were drawn toward him. He did not speak like a man performing for strangers. He spoke like someone unburdening a truth he had carried alone. "In the north," he began, "winter doesn't come the way it does here." Already his voice held the cold. It doesn't creep, it doesn't announce itself gently. It arrives like a judgment. He clasped his hands in his lap, staring down at the chipped tin cup beside him. In late autumn, the sky changes first. It becomes pale. Not white, not gray, just pale. Like something has drained the color out of the air. When I was a child, my mother told me that was the sun becoming tired, that it no longer had strength enough to travel so far north. A faint smile ghosted across his lips. I used to believe her. There was something in his voice then, the faintest tremor, that hinted he no longer believed much of anything. Across the room, Ingrid watched her brother carefully, her hands folded in her lap, her posture straight and protective. Otto had stopped pacing, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, his restless energy temporarily quieted by the gravity in Leif's tone. "Our house," Leif said, lifting his gaze, "stood just outside the forest. A place where the world ended abruptly and the trees began. In summer it was beautiful, but in winter..." He exhaled a long breath through his nose. "In winter, the forest felt alive, listening, waiting. The historian in me knows that every settler brings ghosts across the sea, but none more than those who came from the deep north. Their memories were carved from isolation, frost, and silence. The last winter before we left," Leif continued, "was the harshest I had ever seen. The snow came early. It buried the ground before we had time to prepare. The lake froze solid before the middle of November. And every day, when I walked from the schoolhouse back home, I felt the cold reach deeper into the walls, into the wood, into our bones." He paused. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, as though urging him on. "We had lost our father 2 years before. Illness took him quickly. Ingrid tried to fill the hole he left by tending to everyone around her. And Otto gave a half smile. I tried to fill it by doing absolutely nothing useful. A couple of people, even Sigrid's stern expression, softened at that. Leif shook his head fondly. Otto filled the house with noise. And sometimes anger. Sometimes laughter. But it kept us alive. Madeline, our mother, she did her best. But the loss of our father. Leif swallowed, his voice tightening. Ingrid shifted, looking away. Her shoulders rose subtly, the slight flinch of someone forced to relive something she had buried. When the letter came from our cousin in America, Leif said gently, Mother didn't read it. I did. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded, worn piece of paper. He didn't open it. He simply held it, letting the others see how many times it had been read, unfolded, and handled. She said she didn't want to hear lies of golden fields or easy fortune, he went on. But I didn't hear lies. I heard possibility. Ingrid's voice came softly from across the room. It was the first time in months that Leif looked hopeful. Leif nodded, gratitude flickering in his expression. But hope, he said, does not fill empty bellies, or stop debts from growing, or change the fact that our landlord intended to raise rent again come spring. Snow hammered the shutters. Someone in the crowded upper floor coughed violently. A distant ship bell rang in the harbor. Leif continued. We decided to leave after a night when the fire went out. The cold woke us. Mother shaking, Ingrid's hands blue, Otto stumbling over his own feet trying to relight the stove, and the frost on the windows. He paused. For the first time, his composure faltered. The frost had formed shapes, patterns, like branches, like fingers. A hush fell over the room. Even the Bjørnssons, familiar with superstition, exchanged glances. Ingrid spoke again, her tone lower, steadier, as if taking the story's weight into her own hands. Leif thought it was a sign. I thought it was exhaustion. But either way, we agreed on one thing. If winter had already found us so fiercely, it would only grow worse. Staying meant starving. She shifted slightly, remembering. Her eyes glistened, but she blinked the emotion away before it could fall. Leaving, she murmured, meant surviving. Otto lifted his chin then, stepping forward so the candlelight caught his face. His voice was sharper than Leif's, less poetic, more burning with raw truth. Our mother did not live long enough to see us leave. A murmur rippled through the families. Otto clenched his jaw. She died in her sleep. We buried her under the old birch tree behind the house. The ground was so hard that Kalle would have needed 2 days to dig it. But Leif found a way. He always did. The Finns watched him with a quiet, pained recognition. They knew how frost could steal people quickly. Otto continued, his voice rougher now. We didn't pack much. We didn't need to. There wasn't much to bring. He laughed once, short, bitter. But we did bring the stories, the memories, and Leif brought that damned notebook. Leif gave him a weary smile. Words are the one thing I've never lost, and the one thing you can't eat. Otto shot back, but with a glimmer of a... The historian in me sees the truth in their banter. families rarely break all at once. They crack. They splinter. And sometimes they hold together only by the warmth of shared grief. The storm raged outside. The room was still. Leif inhaled deeply. So we left Umeå. First by sled, then by ship, then by train through Stockholm, then across the continent. He looked around the room, at the Finns, at the Bjørnssons, at the damp wooden beams that framed the place where 3 destinies had met. And now we're here, he finished, in Liverpool, at the edge of the world. No one spoke for several moments. The storm howled through the alley outside. A lantern flickered. Somewhere upstairs, a baby began to cry. Finally, Liv Bjørnsson murmured through the hush. "You have walked through deep winter," she said, "but the world you go to holds winters of its own." The words hung there, not a warning, not a comfort, but a truth. And thus the first night ended, as the historian records it. With the sound of a storm, the weight of old snow settling in new hearts, and 3 families realizing that perhaps their fates were already intertwining. The room had grown warmer since Leif finished speaking, though the storm outside only intensified. Rain hammered the shutters like impatient fists, and the timbers of the lodging house creaked in protest. But inside, something had shifted. Not comfort. No, not yet. But recognition. It is a curious thing how strangers become less strange when grief is spoken aloud. Leif's final words still hung in the air like frost that refused to melt, and though silence followed, it was no longer the uneasy stillness of earlier. It was a silence of invitation, one story opening the door for another. Runa, now fully awake, sat curled against Ingrid's side, thumb tucked between her small teeth. Erik Bjørnsson watched this with a tenderness he did not try to hide. The man's broad shoulders seemed, for the first time that night, less rigid. Liv Bjørnsson, old as winter's bones and twice as unyielding, was the one who finally broke the stillness. "Then it is my turn," she said. Her voice was low, but it carried. Even the storm seemed to pause, curious. Liv did not sit straighter. She did not clear her throat. She simply began, as though the tale had been waiting decades for this exact moment. "Norway teaches you to listen," she said. "Before you learn to walk on ice, or mend a fishing net, or gut your first herring, you learn to listen. The sea speaks first, then the mountains, then the wind." Kalevala exchanged a glance with Sigrid. They knew this truth as well as she did. Liv's eyes, gray as granite cliffs, drifted toward the hearth. "Eric's father, my son, was a fisherman. A stubborn one to believe the sea owed him a living. It doesn't. The sea owes no one anything." Her hands folded in her lap, fingers bent with age, but steady. One February, he set out before dawn, though the sky warned him not to. I begged him to wait. So did half the village. He laughed at us all. She inhaled sharply through her nose, the slightest tremor crossing her features. He never came back. A hush fell so complete that even the crackle of the hearth seemed muted. Erik stared at the floor, his expression carved from stone. He had heard this story before, but tonight it carried a different weight. shared before witnesses who might carry it beyond the Bjørnsson line. I raised Erik myself, taught him the nets, taught him the winds, taught him to fear the sea only as much as necessary, no more, no less. Her gaze shifted to her son, and the years between then and now tightened around her words. But the sea took more than a husband. It took the future we thought we had. The debts grew. The herring disappeared. The landlord threatened to claim the house if we didn't pay by spring. A bitter smile tugged at her thin lips. When the letter came from Erik's cousin in Minnesota, promising work, land, and a fresh start, I knew our path was chosen. She tapped her cane lightly on the floorboards. But leaving Norway... Her voice softened. That is like tearing a mountain from its roots. The historian in me has written those words in margins again and again. Leaving is its own kind of death, but also its own kind of birth. Liv leaned back, breathing slowly. Anders placed a hand on her shoulder, an uncharacteristically gentle gesture. Across the room, Vaara pulled her blanket closer. Her pale face had warmed with color as she listened, her fear giving way to fascination. The storm outside snarled anew, shaking the window shutters. The wind whistled through a narrow crack like a distant flute. And then, unexpectedly, it was Sigrid Vaara who spoke. "I suppose," Sigrid said carefully, "Finland did not want to let us go either." Her voice was smoother than Leif's, quieter than Liv's, but anchored by a steadiness born of necessity. She sat close to Aino and Kalle, the three of them forming a small island of winter-weary faces near the window. "In Karelia," she began, "the forests are so dense that light feels like something borrowed. When winter comes, it returns the forest to its true shape, silent, endless, and patient." She brushed a loose braid over her shoulder. Aino's mother, my cousin, died the year before. Fever. Aino was only 10. Callie and I took her in. We did what we could, but food was scarce, work scarcer. And when the Russians moved the border patrols closer, Sigrid continued, many families fled farther west. We thought of doing the same, but then a letter came from my uncle in Hancock, Michigan. He said the copper mines needed strong workers, said Finns were always welcome. She almost laughed, a single breath of irony. He did not mention the danger, or the darkness, or the way the mines swallow men whole. The night deepens. Night had settled fully over Liverpool, though in truth it was difficult to tell where evening ended and storm began. The wind pressed hard against the lodging house walls, testing the structure with the persistence of a creature trying to claw its way in. The hallways upstairs groaned beneath the footsteps of sleepless migrants. The air smelled of wet wool, spilled broth, and the nervous sweat of people too tired to rest and too afraid to sleep. Below, in the common room, the three Nordic families sat with a new kind of stillness. Not the awkward hesitation of strangers, but the quiet that follows the sharing of wounds. The historian in me often marks this as the first moment of recognition. Not friendship, not unity, but the earliest thread of connection pulled taut by hardship and memory. But the night, as recorded, was not done with them. For storms, external or otherwise, seldom give people peace simply because they have earned it. the disturbance upstairs. A crash erupted from the upper floor. Not the polite thud of luggage falling, not the soft stirrings of restless sleepers, but a violent shattering, glass against wood, followed by a muffled curse. Aino flinched so hard she pulled the blanket to her chin. Leif and Eric both rose halfway from their seats, instinctively alert. Even Otto stopped his restless pacing and stared toward the staircase. The landlord's voice carried down the stairwell, irritated and hoarse. "I told you, you can't be drinking up there. If you break one more..." Another smash cut him off, then shouting, two voices, both slurred, both angry. "They've been at it since we arrived," Anders muttered, narrowing his eyes. "Irish lads from Galway. Came in the same train car as us. Desperate men drink," Liv murmured, "and desperate men fight. The historian knows this well. Liverpool's lodging houses saw more battles than some seas. But that night, the danger crept closer than anyone expected. A sudden thud shook the ceiling. Dust drifted down from the rafters. Runa whimpered and pressed into Ingrid's side. Then, unmistakably, the sound of someone tumbling down a flight of stairs, the unexpected fall. The families exchanged a single look before all rising at once. Kalle reached the staircase first, followed by Leif and Eric. The others clustered behind them, cautious but ready. At the foot of the stairs lay a young man, barely more than 20. Pale hair plastered to his forehead, blood trickling from a cut above his brow. His breath smelled of stale ale and defeat. He stared up at them through unfocused eyes. They threw me," he slurred. "Said I cheated at cards. I didn't. I swear. I didn't." His chest hitched, half sob, half hiccup. Kalle knelt beside him without hesitation. Finns did not shy from wounded strangers. The North taught its people to tend first and question later. "He's bleeding," Kalle said. "Sigrid, my back." While she retrieved it, Anders stepped forward, jaw clenched. "Where are the ones who threw him?" A voice drifted from above, mocking, angry. "Leave him. Rat tried to steal from us." Another figure appeared at the top of the stairs, broad-shouldered, face red with drink, eyes burning with the restless fury of a man who had lost more than money. "Go back," Leif said evenly. "The night's bad enough." The man spat. "A Swede telling me what to do?" Before Leif could answer, Eric stepped in front of him. Not aggressive, simply immovable. "We don't want trouble," the Norwegian said. The man sneered. "Then stay out of mine." He descended one step, then another, but he didn't expect Anders. The quiet Bjørnsson brother moved with surprising force. He planted himself halfway up the stairs, shoulders squared, eyes cold. That's far enough. For a heartbeat, the storm outside seemed to hold its breath. Then the drunk scoffed, but he did not take another step. Maybe it was Anders' stance, maybe the collective presence of the Nordic men at his back. Or maybe, deep down, even drunken anger recognizes the point where bravado surrenders to consequence. With a final curse, the man retreated, slamming the door behind him. The building shuddered, but the danger passed. The first cooperation. Back in the common room, the families gathered around the injured young man. Sigrid cleaned the wound with steady hands, Aino holding a rag, eager to be useful despite the lingering fear in her eyes. The young man winced. Why help me? He muttered. Leif answered softly. Because someone should. The historian notes that simple line. Because someone should, as the first stitch binding their fates. The young man gave a weak laugh. You'll make fine Americans, then. No one replied. The idea of Americans felt impossibly distant, a shape glimpsed only through fog and desperation. When the young man finally fell asleep on a cot near the hearth, the families drifted back to their places. A new kind of silence. But the atmosphere had changed. The stories had warmed them. The disturbance had tested them. The cooperation had connected them. Outside, thunder rumbled a warning. The storm was far from over, and neither were the trials ahead. But inside, the room held a different silence now. Not heavy, not fearful. A shared silence, a settled silence, a silence that said, we are not alone here. Not anymore. And as the night deepened, the historian in me writes, before they ever stepped onto the great ship, before the Atlantic or the prairies or the years reshaped them, they had already begun crossing. Not an ocean, but the distance between strangers. The night before departure, by the time the commotion upstairs had quieted and the young Irishman had fallen into an exhausted sleep near the hearth, midnight had folded itself into the walls of the lodging house. The storm still raged beyond the thin planks, but inside, a strange calm settled, the kind that arrives after danger has brushed close enough to remind everyone how easily the night can turn. The historian in me always marks this hour as a threshold. The final night before the crossing. The last moment before fate began to fasten its grip around the three Nordic families. But history rarely allows a clean, peaceful ending to any night worth remembering. Something else was coming. A knock at the door. It arrived softly at first. Just 3 quiet taps on the front door. The kind one might overlook in a house full of restless sleepers and storm-worn wood. But Ingrid heard it. She always heard things others missed. She straightened from where she sat with Runa asleep against her side. "Leif," she whispered. "Someone's at the door." Leif rose slowly, careful not to disturb the others. Eric followed, instinct pulling him forward. Otto trailed behind with suspicious eyes. When Leif unlatched the door, a blast of cold rain swept in, and behind it, a man in a postal coat, drenched and hunched against the wind. He thrust a small wax-sealed envelope into Leif's hands. "For Vasterlund," the man said, breathless. "Came late. Told me to hurry." Before they could ask a word, he vanished back into the darkness. Leif stared at the envelope. Thin, folded twice. The seal cracked from moisture, but still bearing the faint impression of a Swedish parish stamp. Sigrid noticed first. A letter? Night? Letters rarely arrived quickly, especially not one sent across countries during a winter storm. Ingrid touched the edge of the envelope, her brow tightening. It must be from home. The silence around them deepened. The contents of the letter. Leif carried the letter to the table, the others gathering behind him, drawn by the kind of dread and hope that only news from home can bring. He unfolded it, cautiously, as though worried the words might collapse. His eyes scanned the page once, then twice. His breath stilled. Leif? Ingrid whispered. He looked up, and the historian in me has written of this moment often. The instant when leaving becomes heavier than staying. It's from Pastor Holmgren, Leif said. Liv straightened. Anders leaned in. He writes that... Leif's voice faltered. He writes that our Uncle Johan is dead. The word struck hard. Otto's mouth opened, then closed again. Ingrid's hand flew to her lips. Leif continued, voice trembling at the edges. He slipped on the frozen river last week. They found him 2 days later under broken ice. The room recoiled in a shared breath, grief recognized across borders. Sigrid bowed her head. Eric muttered a quiet prayer in Norwegian. Aino took Kale's hand, but it was what Leif read next that shifted the room from sorrow into something more dangerous. There is something else, he said. Pastor writes that Johan left behind debts, significant ones. And the landlord intends to claim our father's tool shed and land parcel, unless someone returns to settle it. A long, brutal silence. Ingrid shut her eyes, pain tightening her features. That land is all we had left, and we cannot save it, Otto said sharply. We are here. We leave tomorrow. But Leif didn't answer right away. His gaze remained fixed on the letter, as though the ink itself were burning him. The historian, with all the benefit of years, can say this much. This was the first true test of their resolve. Not the storm, not the fight, not the hardship behind them, but this choice, a terrible choice. It says, Leif whispered, that if one of us returns home before spring, the parish might help negotiate, might delay the claim. He looked at Ingrid, then Otto, his siblings, his remaining family. If I go back, you can't. Ingrid's voice cracked like ice under weight. Leif, you can't. We've come too far. It's not just the distance, Otto added. It's money, time, the crossing. We don't have anything left to spend. But the land, Leif murmured. It is already lost, Ingrid said, her voice steadier now, quiet and firm as snow settling after a storm. And we are not. Those words carried a finality that cut deeper than the letter. Liv Bjørnsson, who had lost husband, home, and country, nodded once. Land can be taken, but futures can be built. Aino swallowed hard. Sigrid, what would you do? She asked. Sigrid hesitated, then answered with the calm of someone who had already buried too many things she loved. I would go forward, she said. Not because it is easy, but because going back carries ghosts. And going forward carries possibility. Leif closed his eyes. The historian writes that this was the moment the Vasterlunds crossed a threshold. The realization that the old world was already slipping from their grasp, piece by painful piece. When he opened his eyes again, Leif folded the letter gently and tucked it into his coat. It is decided, he said softly. We go on. A different kind of bond, something subtle shifted among the families then, a tightening like fibers twisting into rope. Not sympathy, not pity, but understanding. They had all lost something to winter, to poverty, to fate. But now they shared the loss. And the decision to move forward. As the storm battered the walls outside, the three Nordic families sat closer. Not by design, but by gravity, drawn to one another like travelers around the last fire on earth. Eric tended the flames. Sigrid checked the young Irishman's bandage once more. Otto finally stopped pacing long enough to sit beside Anders. Ingrid held Runa, humming a Swedish lullaby so soft it seemed woven into the storm. And Leif, forever the quiet observer, opened his notebook and wrote a single line. Tonight, we learned what must be left behind. The historian in me has always considered that line the unofficial beginning of the saga. The moment when the Northern Crossing stopped being merely a voyage and became a destiny.